Everyone, I'm Haoxi, a PhD candidate from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today, I'm very happy to share my ongoing research, the fearful realism, monsters, and ghosts in Chinese horror independent video games. In this presentation, I hope to discuss the relation and the tension between horror and realism in a specific social cultural context by analyzing monsters and ghosts in indie horror games from mainland China. The presentation will be divided into 5 parts. I will start with the context of Chinese indie horror games. Then I will define horror and monster, and then we will go to the case study to talk about the monsters and the ghosts in Firework. And in the game Firework, okay, it's a game. And in the end, I will explain what I call the fearful realism. So Chinese horror has become one of the most active genre in the Chinese game industry today. Existing research on this genre focus mainly on 2 Taiwan indie games by Red Kettle Games, Detention and Devotion. They emphasize the relationship of these 2 games with Taiwan's historical trauma or folk religions. However, as you can see in the list, many Chinese horror game emerged in mainland China, and this game haven't been studied yet. So I want to fill the gap through the study of one of the most successful mainland indie horror game, the Firework. In China, our cultural tradition, horror has long been marginalized by the official culture. And in modern China, horror as a symbol of superstition is the object that the Enlightenment and the modernity project needs to overcome. So, and also in the People's Republic of China, as Li Kunpang has argued, is a state against ghosts. She wrote, ghosts and horror stories, particularly with contemporary setting, were destined to be purged. So the popularity of horror game in mainland China is surprisingly, especially considering the struggle of horror films in mainland China. While the censorship is one of the reasons for the decline of mainland horror films, video games face no less censorship than films. However, independent video game can partly bypass censorship and release directly on Steam. So it provides a rare space for Chinese independent games to have the visibility. Of course, self-censorship still exists. For example, the 2 Taiwanese horror game can focus on historical and political trauma, which the topic has not yet been seen in mainland horror games. But as this study shows, some Chinese horror games in mainland still actively engaged with contemporary cultural politics. So the Firework, our case, this is an indie horror puzzle game created in 2021 by Shiying Studio. It sells a lot and it get more than 30,000 reviews on Steam with overwhelmingly positive. So it will also be adapted into a TV series, which is really rare in Chinese media industry. And in Firework, player take on the role of a supernatural police detective Lin Lixun to reinvestigate a closed case of murder in a mountain village. So before the case study, let me have a brief definition of horror and the monsters. I mean, this definition just the definition I used in my discussion is not the standard definition. Okay, in real horror, Robert Solomon distinguished several emotions and feelings like horror, disgust, shock, fear, terror, anxiety, etc. According to him, horror is an extremely unpleasant and even traumatizing emotional experience that renders the subject helpless and violate his or her most rudimentary expectation about the world. So the real horror can never be enjoyable. But the art horror, the horror that we experience in artwork and other cultural artifacts, is make-believe, so we can gain pleasure from it, as in many commercial horror film and horror games. But also, we can reflect on it, as this case and other serious fictions shows. And so move to the monsters. Robin Wood has a famous suggested a basic formula for the horror film, and it also works for video games, I think. He said the horror is normality is threatened by the monsters. So the normality is a state of conformity with dominant social norms, or as Solomon suggests, is following his or her most rudimentary expectation about the world. Monsters change with normality and the situation. It does not have to be huge supernatural creatures. Sometimes ordinary things can become monsters that are dangerous to normalities. I use monster more as a metaphor instead of some real tangible creatures, because in Firework at first glance we found the absence of monsters. In Western mainstream horror game market and academia, the survival horror game almost dominate the connotation of horror games. In survival horror games, monsters are easy to identify, and they are often represented as zombies, aliens, creatures, and other enemies. By fighting against or escaping from them, the players can purge the monsters and restore and protect normalities. But the Firework is a narrative-driven point-and-click adventure puzzle game. There is no enemies to fight. Players don't have to face the threat of death, so there is no pressure to survive. And the only piece of escape gameplay in this game is a fake one, which means the game can just stand there, do nothing, and after 5 seconds, the plot will proceed as usual. So how about the puzzles? As a puzzle game, all the puzzles are simple, and there's no time limit and the penalty. So the puzzle cannot be the monster too, the monsters. So now we got to the tricky questions. Where is the horror and where are the monsters? I suggest only by returning to the storytelling we can discover the horror and the monstrosity of this game. In this modern case, a couple, the daughter-in-law and the granddaughter, were all found dead some months after the death of the son. And the daughter-in-law, Zhao Xiaojuan, was considered as a murderer. The truth is, Zhao Xiaojuan's parents-in-law, the Tian's family, missed the deceased son so much, and they wished to bring him back to life in the body of Zhao Xiaojuan by poisoning her. So and all this because of superstition of folk beliefs. And the granddaughter accidentally put the poison to the meal. And when Zhao Xiaojuan came home, he saw everyone die, especially her beloved daughter. So she's totally broke down and decided to suicide. So even in this simplified narrative that omits some secondary characters, we find that the story has a complex the game has a complex story. So it shows us the complexity of humanity and the reflection through the detailed portrayal of the plot and the characters. The more detailed the tragedy is, the more player will be able to reach the point of the Aristotelian catharsis. We will return to this concept later. And the detailed narrative also help us to better understand the cause of the tragedy. The monsters that destroy everything are not tangible supernatural beings, but feudal, but feudal superstitions in people's mind. In the first sense of firework, Lin Yixun, the protagonist, stand in front of a wall on which it written, "Believe in science, not superstitions." This slogan recalls the critical tradition of the late Qing dynasty and the May 4th new cultural movement in China. After the death of her husband, Zhao Xiaozhuan faced the control and oppression her from her parents-in-law under the patriarchal tradition, and the tragedy of death come from the superstitions. So after 100 years, once again, the game criticized the evil of feudal superstition and the patriarchy, especially opposition of women. And besides the story, there's one visual image I think is worth to discuss, the paper dolls. In Firework and many other Chinese horror games, paper dolls are often represented. Paper dolls are used for traditional Chinese funeral rituals. Because of this association with death, it may evoke fear. And there's no doubt that such things as a humanoid will evoke the uncanny valley effect. So paper dolls are the typical monsters in Chinese horror games. For example, they can be used for jump scares or used in survival horror games as enemies. But paper dolls in Firework works not as monsters, but as symbols of monstrosities of the pre-modern. They They prove the relationship between Chinese horror and the enlightenment project of Chinese modernity. I want to emphasize that the paper dolls here, they don't have eyelids. They are always gazing at the characters as well as the player outside the screen. And as this screenshot says, the paper dolls of various shapes stood in the distance, seemingly able to feel the grim gaze. The gaze is really important for us to understand the horror in Chinese horror games. I call it the fear of the gaze. In Lu Xun's Diary of a Madman, which is one of the most important modern fiction in Chinese culture, when the protagonist discovers the man-eating truth of Chinese tradition, he is horrified by all the people around him because he sees the man-eating gaze in their eyes. So here is the list of in that short novel of all the texts relevant to look or eyes. So we can see there are lots of examples, and it shows the connection between Chinese modernity and visuality, as many scholars have in Chinese study has already argued. So let's talk back to video games. As a player sees the truth of the case, they will also see the horror behind it and be seen by the paper dolls, like the madman. The heart of Chinese horror is the oppression of authority its underneath its calm and peaceful surface. These paper dolls do not move or attack players, and in turn, the player cannot defeat or escape from them. They are as static as the background because they represent the very soil and the structural problem that gave rise to the tragedy and evil. That is, the inextricable vestige of pre-modern patriarchy, hierarchy, and superstition in contemporary China. The horror in-game is as same as Lu Xun's writing, so it supports the idea of Liu Fan, who says that the Chinese modernity is an incomplete project. But does this game really repeat the Enlightenment project as Lu Xun. Interestingly, the Enlightenment and anti-superstition here is ambiguous. In fireworks, scientific and rational methods of chemical investigation are ineffective and wrong. So Lin Lixun, as a player, used supernatural methods to find out the truth. So this questions the hierarchy of science and superstition, and if the slogan and enlightenment is so effective, then such tragedy should not happen. So thus the criticism of the monster of fragile superstition turns to a reflection on the promise of modernity and an attempt to do justice to memory with the help of ghosts. As Walter Benjamin says, truth is not a matter of expression which destroys the secret, but a revelation that does just to it. In Firework, player gets help from two female ghosts, Zhao Xiaojuan and Chen Qingsui. These two ghosts have character portraits that looks like real human, and Chen Qingsui has been the only conversational NPC for a long time. It makes many players believe she is not a ghost. The ambiguity of ghosts is important because in the first ancient Chinese dictionary, Erya, there is an explanation of ghost. The meaning of ghost is that which returns. What really returns is the memory. Ghosts can not come back to life, but they can challenge the boundary between reality and fantasy, archive and memory, amnesia and remembrance. This opens space to the rigid structure of the living world. In the concept of spectral time, haunted realism, and writing as revenant, we all see the ghost promise a space for counter memory in different kind of cultural artifacts like novel, films, and art. So in video games, this is achieved through the mechanics of archival adventure. Archival adventure is as Melissa Kangan defined, asks player to assemble a story by piecing it together from the archival memorabilia left behind. The ghost and the relics appear in games, inviting player into memory space for the past, exploring and rescuing the forbidden and repressed memory before the coffin is closed. But unlike many realistic literature, the real problems are not even imaginatively solved in the end. There's nothing we can do to change what is already happened in the game, which the truths we found through supernatural forces cannot be used as evidence under the rational order of reality. Zhao Xiaojuan is still the murderer in the official archive, and this makes the catharsis impossible because as I said, nothing changed. We can't solve the problem. But it is important because we need to bear the burden of memory. This is not the road to easiness, but to responsibility and justice. As Derrida has said, it's necessary to speak of the ghost, indeed, to the ghost and with it, etc. So the ghost and justice and memory, they are all connected in this game. So what my presentation trying to tell is the affinity between realism and horror, because when you want to criticize and reflect on the structural problem of society, you will intangibly see the dark and the ghostly side. In David Wong's new book, Fearful Imagination, he borrows the concept of Hannah Arendt's fearful imagination to explore how contemporary Chinese fiction can imagine the unimaginable and speak of the unspeakable evil and the monsters of history through a kind of insinkable and fearful imagination and writings, thus cause uneasiness and reflection in society and readers. In this sense, horror is not entirely a negative effect. Chinese horror game put this fearful imagination into the form of game, inviting players to open the Pandora's box to see and imagine the evil of authority and structure that has been obscured and forgotten. This evil threatens not only the normality of characters in the game, but also everyone in reality. By experiencing fictional horror, we are empowered to imagine and express the real horror we encountered in our life. And because of the failure of catharsis, we are capable to develop and release the power of change. So that's what I call the fearful realism. Thank you. Okay.